The cotton plantation lay deep in a section of the American South where dirt roads dissolved into mud for half the year and dust for the other, and where the nearest town was far enough away that the plantation functioned almost as its own isolated jurisdiction. Its hundreds of acres were carved into fields that stretched in long, uninterrupted rows, with a few narrow paths winding toward the slave quarters, the barns, and the owner's house that stood on a slight rise overlooking everything. The plantation operated through a rigid system of routines established long before the current overseers arrived, and each day unfolded according to a schedule that rarely wavered. By the first light of dawn, the enslaved workers were already on their feet, pushed into motion by habit, fear, or exhaustion. Overseers placed themselves at fixed points along the fields, and the hierarchy that governed this world moved into alignment like pieces locking into place. The owner expected measurable production, and the entire system existed to deliver that expectation. Nothing else, neither weather, nor illness, nor private suffering, was considered sufficient reason to disturb the flow of labor. This structure had been in place for decades, making each morning feel identical to the ones that preceded it, and although small changes occasionally appeared, the plantation's overall rhythm felt as unyielding as an institution made of stone. The main overseer, the one responsible for daily organization of the fields, tried to maintain the system without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. He had been raised in environments where compliance was less a choice than a requirement, and where questioning authority had consequences that were not easily forgotten. His father had introduced him early to the expectations tied to overseeing labor, instructing him not through explanation, but by exposing him to scenes that left lasting impressions. Some of those scenes resurfaced in brief flashes whenever he walked past the whipping post or when he heard the sharp crack of a lash somewhere on the grounds. These memories did not come in poetic images, but rather in plain, factual recollections. The shape of a scar, the expression of someone bracing for impact, the silence that followed each blow. Over time, he learned to behave in predictable ways, to avoid drawing attention, and to implement the rules in a manner that would not provoke questions from the plantation owner while still limiting unnecessary cruelty when he could. That tension, constant and unspoken, shaped nearly every decision he made. He did not keep a personal biography, but he kept a journal. The notebook was thin, cheaply bound, and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters. It was never meant to exist. Overseers were not expected to record anything beyond production figures. But he had developed the habit years earlier of writing down facts that troubled him or incidents he feared he might otherwise forget, and the entries gradually formed a record not of his life in general, but of specific actions, observations, and troubling inconsistencies that emerged around him. He never wrote in a dramatic tone. Each entry contained straightforward accounts of what he saw. A punishment he felt could have been avoided, a heated argument between overseers, a suspicious injury, a sudden shift in the owner's mood, or a quiet warning exchanged among enslaved workers. Using the journal did not alleviate his discomfort, but it gave him a way to document what he considered important without drawing attention from those around him. The risk lay in being discovered, yet he continued the practice because the alternative felt like surrendering entirely to the system. Several key figures shaped the atmosphere of the plantation beyond the owner himself. The owner's son, a young man with a reputation for recklessness, moved freely through every part of the grounds, often at times when others did not expect to see him. His presence put people, enslaved workers and overseers alike, on edge. While he was officially responsible for managing supply shipments and assisting in seasonal planning, he routinely involved himself in matters unrelated to his assigned duties, especially when it came to the domestic enslaved women who worked inside the main house. Other overseers had learned to look the other way when the sun appeared in places or at hours that made no sense. Questioning him brought consequences. Another important figure was the senior overseer, a man whose loyalty to the owner had been proven many times over, and who treated any deviation from the plantation's strict hierarchy as a personal threat. He monitored the main overseer closely, suspecting him of being too hesitant, too deliberate, or too introspective for the job. The enslaved community itself contained individuals who had, through long experience, become excellent observers. One domestic servant, in particular, moved constantly between the main house and the quarters, connecting spaces that were otherwise strictly separated, and thus unintentionally served as an information channel for those willing to pay attention. In this environment, where every action had both a visible and an invisible effect, the first spark of conflict appeared almost quietly. Early one morning, while inspecting tools near the smokehouse, the main overseer noticed a dark stain near the corner of the structure. It was small, easily overlooked, and could have resulted from any number of ordinary accidents. Yet it did not fit with the previous day's records, which listed no injuries and no incidents requiring medical attention. His first instinct was to ignore it, to categorize it mentally as a meaningless detail, but something about its placement felt wrong. The stain lay in a spot rarely used for any practical purpose, a place where workers did not typically gather. He looked around to see if any overseers or enslaved workers were within view, and, seeing no one, crouched briefly to examine it. The ground seemed mildly disturbed nearby, as if someone had stepped heavily there during the night. He straightened himself and forced his attention back to his regular responsibilities, silently reminding himself that speculating about isolated details could lead him into trouble. Still, the moment lodged itself in his thoughts throughout the morning, resurfacing each time he checked the progress of the field crews. Later that afternoon, while accounting for the workers assigned to different parts of the fields, he noticed an absence that had not been present the previous day. One of the young men who worked near the far edge of the plantation did not appear during roll call, and when questioned, other workers offered hesitant explanations. Some claimed not to have seen him after nightfall. Others avoided eye contact altogether. When he reported the absence to the senior overseer, he was told that the worker had likely attempted escape and that a search would be arranged only if the owner considered it necessary. The dismissal came too quickly, too conveniently, and reminded the main overseer of similar cases in the past where a disappearance had been concealed under a narrative of escape. The pattern unsettled him. He returned to his quarters that night with the uneasy sense that the stain behind the smokehouse and the missing worker were connected, although he lacked evidence to draw any conclusion. That night he wrote his observations in the journal. The entry contained only the essential facts: the stain, the missing worker, the dismissive explanation provided by the senior overseer, and the uncertain reactions from the enslaved community. He did not attempt to interpret or speculate. He merely recorded, noting that he would revisit the entry if additional information surfaced. Hiding the notebook required caution. He waited until the sounds of movement in the quarters faded before lifting the floorboard and sliding the journal into its place. He then lay awake longer than usual, analyzing each detail from the day and trying to determine what his responsibilities required. The plantation had survived for decades on silence, both forced and voluntary, and breaking that pattern meant inviting consequences not only for himself, but potentially for others as well. The next day confirmed his suspicion that a subtle shift had begun. Overseers moved with heightened vigilance, as if uncertain what might surface. The senior overseer barked instructions with more aggression than usual, framing the situation as a test of discipline and order. The owner's son appeared near the fields twice during the morning, lingering longer than necessary and watching groups of enslaved workers with an intensity that suggested he was assessing their reactions more than their labor. Rumors circulated quietly among the enslaved population, though the main overseer received them only indirectly through watched glances or carefully timed pauses in movement. The unofficial communication networks within the community shifted in a way that suggested fear had increased overnight, although no one dared speak openly. What had felt like a minor anomaly the day before now began to feel like the opening of something deeper. By the end of the day, tension had spread across the plantation like an unseen pressure. The owner issued a new rule requiring all movements after nightfall to be strictly monitored, claiming it was to prevent further attempted escapes. The rule appeared reasonable on the surface, but its timing seemed too closely aligned with the missing worker. The main overseer again considered raising his concerns, but held back, recognizing that doing so without evidence would only draw scrutiny toward himself. Instead, he observed the reactions. Enslaved workers moving with cautious precision, overseers stepping more heavily into their roles, and the owner's family acting as though something deeply disruptive had occurred that they intended to conceal. As workers dispersed to their quarters that evening, the main overseer remained in the fields longer than usual, staring toward the distant tree line where the missing worker would have had to pass if he truly attempted escape. Nothing about the landscape suggested movement or disturbance. The silence did not feel natural, it felt imposed. He found himself returning mentally to the stain near the smokehouse and to the way the ground had seemed disturbed there. The detail now took on new weight. He realized that the shift in atmosphere did not result from the disappearance alone, but from the anticipation of what might follow if someone discovered the truth. The main overseer senses that the plantation has moved to a state of heightened risk where questions, even unspoken ones, can have consequences. The enslaved workers demonstrate a quiet vigilance born from long experience. The overseers exhibit defensive aggression. The owner and his son radiate an alertness that suggests they fear exposure of something more serious than an escape attempt. The main overseer acknowledges internally that he now occupies a precarious position. The journal under his floorboard contains facts that, by themselves, seem harmless, yet combined they form the beginnings of a narrative the plantation leadership would not tolerate. He understands that he has taken his first irreversible step simply by recognizing the inconsistency and choosing to record it. The story's central tension has been set in motion. He can continue documenting what he sees, risking his safety and possibly his life, or he can suppress his questions and remain complicit in maintaining a system that punishes truth as severely as rebellion. By the following week, the plantation moved under a noticeably heavier strain, as if every person living or working on the property had been pulled tighter by an invisible rope. The disappearance of the young worker had shifted from an isolated irregularity into a source of ongoing disturbance. The owner insisted on daily head counts delivered with strict precision, and although the plantation had experienced disappearances before, none had triggered such a prolonged reaction. The main overseer realized that the leadership was not responding to the loss of labor, but to the threat of something left behind. Some trace or knowledge they feared had not been contained. He moved through each day fully aware that the boundaries of his responsibilities had begun to change. Where he once focused on productivity and schedule, he now navigated a terrain in which every action, even the smallest, could intersect with tensions he could not openly acknowledge. The new restrictions implemented under the pretense of tighter security altered the routines of the enslaved workers and the overseers alike. Night patrols were doubled, and the senior overseer spent hours walking the perimeter as if expecting to intercept someone returning rather than fleeing. The owner's son developed an erratic pattern of movement that kept the main overseer guessing. Sometimes he appeared among the fields early in the morning, observing the workers with a scrutiny that seemed less about labor and more about verifying what expressions surfaced on their faces. Other times he disappeared altogether during daylight hours, only to reappear around dusk with clothes slightly disordered and temper noticeably strained. These changes did not go unnoticed by the enslaved population, who moved with increased caution, avoiding any expression of interest or alarm that might attract suspicion. Their silence indicated more awareness than they could safely convey. In this climate of escalating tension, the main overseer attempted to perform his responsibilities as if nothing had changed. Yet each choice he made revealed his internal conflict. He handled instructions from the senior overseer with measured restraint, trying to execute them without adding unnecessary severity. When ordering work assignments, he paid closer attention to the physical conditions of the workers, adjusting tasks in small, unobtrusive ways that spared the most exhausted individuals from the harshest labor. These subtle decisions were risky. The senior overseer had already complained privately to the owner that the main overseer lacked firmness, and the increased pressure created new opportunities for that criticism to turn into formal scrutiny. Still, the main overseer found himself unable to shift fully into the role expected of him. The unease in the air amplified his own discomfort, making it difficult to ignore the moral questions that had been growing since he first observed the stain behind the smokehouse. The enslaved workers, sensing his internal struggle even without direct communication, began acting differently around him. Their movements became more deliberate when he approached, not out of fear, but out of a cautious evaluation of whether he might serve as a possible conduit for information. One evening, during a brief moment when the senior overseer was occupied elsewhere, an older field hand paused before returning to the quarters and looked at the main overseer with an expression that seemed to carry meaning without a single word. It was not a plea and not an accusation, simply a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed and that the overseer was no longer perceived purely as an enforcer of the system. This unspoken shift unsettled him even more than hostility would have. He did not want to become a confidant or ally, yet his own actions had begun drifting him in that direction. One of the consequences of the heightened restrictions was the appearance of small but persistent rumors. The enslaved women in the main house moved with sharper alertness, careful to avoid situations in which the owner's son might corner them. Domestic servants reported hearing fragments of arguments between the owner and his son, discussions cut short when staff approached. The workers in the fields exchanged glances indicating new fears, the details of which the overseers could sense even without hearing them. It was clear to the main overseer that the missing worker might not have been the only individual entangled in the trouble. Whatever had happened seemed connected to a larger pattern of behavior that many had witnessed, but none could safely discuss. These rumors intensified his sense that he needed to understand more, even though doing so placed him at risk. The decisive moment in the deepening tension came when the main overseer discovered a small piece of fabric lodged under a ridge of dirt near the same smokehouse corner where he had seen the stain. He found it by accident while inspecting tools. It was nothing more than a torn scrap, but he recognized it from the shirt the missing worker wore during his last day in the fields. The fabric had been hastily buried, the ground still slightly softer than the surrounding soil, indicating the disruption had been recent. He glanced around to ensure no one watched, then palmed the fabric and slipped it into his coat. The decision to keep it, rather than report it, was instinctive. His judgment, shaped by weeks of observation, told him that turning the fragment over to leadership would not lead to an honest investigation. Instead, it would invite suspicion toward him for having handled evidence improperly, and perhaps toward anyone else who might be connected to the discovery. Keeping it, however, bound him irrevocably to whatever truth the plantation leadership sought to hide. That evening, he added an entry to his journal, documenting the discovery with the same terse specificity as before. He noted the location, the condition of the soil, the appearance of the fabric, and the timing of the find. He refrained from writing any interpretation of these facts, understanding that speculation would only complicate matters. Yet as he slid the journal back into its hiding place, he recognized that he had crossed a threshold he could not retreat from. He now possessed something tangible that connected him directly to a disappearance the leadership insisted on explaining away. The journal no longer held abstract suspicions. It contained evidence. The following days revealed subtle but unmistakable consequences. The senior overseer's attitude shifted from general suspicion to targeted vigilance. He seemed to watch the main overseer more closely, appearing unexpectedly during work inspections and lingering long after offering instructions. On several occasions, he asked questions that appeared casual on the surface, yet carried implications of distrust, as if testing whether the main overseer might reveal something under pressure. The main overseer responded with measured neutrality, aware that even his tone might be interpreted as defensive or evasive. This strained interaction made every routine task feel like a potential trap. Meanwhile, the owner's son began showing signs of agitation that were difficult to conceal. He walked the grounds late at night, a behavior noticed by both enslaved workers and overseers. He confronted certain individuals in ways that seemed disproportionate, berating them for minor mistakes, questioning their whereabouts at specific hours, or accusing them of withholding information. These interactions fed new waves of fear, causing the domestic workers to adjust their movements with extreme caution. The main overseer, observing these developments from a distance, felt increasing certainty that the son's behavior was directly connected to the disappearance and that the leadership feared exposure more than rebellion. The plantation's internal alliances began to shift. Among the enslaved workers, subtle groupings formed based on trust and shared knowledge. They communicated through brief gestures, rhythmic movements, or seemingly insignificant changes in routine. The main overseer noticed that certain individuals exchanged glances or quietly positioned themselves near one another during work breaks. He recognized the early formation of protective networks designed to pass information and safeguard vulnerable members of the community. These networks always emerged when danger increased, and their presence indicated that the enslaved workers collectively understood far more about the situation than any overseer did. The main overseer's attempts to gather information became increasingly cautious. Instead of asking direct questions, he observed patterns, listening for inconsistencies in official explanations. One evening, a domestic servant returned from the big house with visible tension in her posture, and although she did not speak directly to him, her rigid movements suggested she had witnessed something alarming. Later that night, he found her near the well, her expression guarded, her hands shaking faintly. She stood within range of his line of sight long enough to convey that she wanted him to notice her distress, but she did not risk any interaction that might betray her. Her behavior only confirmed his belief that the truth involved actions the owner's family would go to great lengths to deny. Pressure escalated further when a second rule was introduced by the owner. Overseers were now required to maintain detailed logs of every worker's whereabouts at all times during the day. This order was justified as a response to concerns about organizational lapses, but the main overseer recognized it as a method of increasing surveillance. The rule also forced him into closer, more intrusive management of individuals who already viewed him with a mixture of fear and hesitant trust. Each entry he recorded felt like a betrayal, yet refusing to comply was not an option. The situation placed him directly between conflicting responsibilities, loyalty to the system that employed him, and an emerging sense of obligation toward those harmed by that system. One evening, exhaustion pressing into every muscle, he sat on the edge of his bed and weighed the implications of returning the torn fabric to the earth. If he buried it, he could pretend he had never seen it, harmonizing his actions with the official story. Doing so would allow him to maintain the appearance of compliance and might reduce the scrutiny he was experiencing. Yet the thought of discarding the evidence made him uneasy. It felt like erasing the worker's existence entirely, as if participating in the system's attempt to rewrite events. Keeping it, however, meant continuing down a path where each step carried increasing risk. The torn scrap of fabric lay in a small box beneath his cot, acting as a physical reminder of the decision he had not fully admitted he had made. The consequences of his hesitation manifested in a tightening sense of danger. He became aware of footsteps lingering near his quarters at night, pauses followed by retreating steps. The senior overseer began questioning him more frequently about whether he had noticed unusual behaviors. The owner's son, once indifferent to his presence, started watching him with a particular sharpness, as if suspecting his awareness exceeded what an overseer should know. The enslaved community, while offering no overt communication, responded with growing understanding that he was entangled in something far larger than a simple disappearance. The shift in atmosphere left him with a realization that he could no longer remain neutral. His actions, collecting evidence, documenting details, noticing patterns, had already positioned him in opposition to those who controlled the plantation. He had not chosen to challenge the system deliberately, yet his conscience had pushed him into a role that carried consequences he could not escape. The tension pressing through the plantation revealed itself not as a temporary disruption, but as the early stages of a conflict that would force him to decide whether survival or truth would guide his next steps. The weeks that followed the disappearance of the field hand reshaped the entire plantation into something sharper, colder, and more suffocating than before, as if the land itself had tightened its grip on everyone who lived or worked on it. The owner brought in a new overseer, a man known across neighboring counties for keeping order through a combination of relentless surveillance and unpredictable violence. His presence alone altered routines that had been stable for years, replacing them with methods that reduced people to instruments of fear. He arrived before daylight and remained past dusk, pacing between rows, observing every movement with a gaze that suggested each action was being measured for potential disobedience. Productivity initially rose in short bursts as the enslaved workers attempted to avoid attracting attention, but the increase could not endure the exhaustion caused by the constant threat of punishment. Within days, people began stumbling from fatigue, injuring themselves with tools, or collapsing from heat and stress. The new overseer responded not with adjustments or mercy, but with harsher expectations, insisting that every falter was evidence of hidden resistance encouraged by the missing man, whom the owner now openly accused of theft to justify sweeping measures that affected the entire plantation community. As fear spread through the fields and the quarters, the attitudes of several individuals shifted in ways that revealed their true positions within the fragile hierarchy of power and survival. Some enslaved workers, usually silent, began to take small risks by sharing fragments of knowledge with the protagonist, their motivations unclear, perhaps self-protection, desperation, or a belief he might intervene. A few of these whispered disclosures hinted at a deeper network of awareness. They had seen or heard things in the days before the man disappeared, especially regarding the owner's son and his volatile presence near the quarters. In contrast, a previously cordial assistant overseer, someone who once exchanged brief, neutral acknowledgments, distanced himself from the protagonist and displayed new signs of allegiance to the owner and the senior overseer. He lingered near conversations, noted interactions in the fields, and positioned himself as an observer not of labor, but of loyalty. His change in demeanor served as a warning that the protagonist's movements were no longer unnoticed, and that even the smallest deviation from routine could be interpreted as a threat to plantation order. Meanwhile, The owner's wife began expressing her suspicions in subtle but penetrating ways, directing domestic servants to report on conversations, behaviors, or unexplained absences. Her attempts to assert control over the household reflected both her fear of scandal and her desire to re-establish dominance now that whispers of wrongdoing seemed dangerously close to reaching her. Under growing pressure, the protagonist decided that the only way to understand the full truth was to confront the domestic servant who had previously hinted at knowing more about the missing worker's fate. Her reluctance to speak gave way to a bleak necessity once she realized the new overseer's presence meant that silence offered no safety. She recounted a crucial sequence of events. The owner's son had confronted the missing worker in a moment of fury rooted in a long pattern of exploitation involving one of the young women in the quarters. Whether the confrontation was planned, spontaneous, or fueled by humiliation, the result was fatal. According to her, the death was neither accidental nor provoked by anything other than the son's sense of entitlement and rage. The body had been moved under cover of night by two men loyal to the family, and the disappearance had been crafted as a narrative of theft to justify the harsh new regime. Hearing this, the protagonist recognized the weight of what he now carried. He retreated to his quarters and wrote a meticulous, incriminating account in his journal, capturing every detail he could remember from the servant's account and his own observations since the incident. The journal had begun as a private refuge but had transformed into something more dangerous, a record that, if discovered, could destroy him. Realizing that keeping the journal in its usual hiding place was no longer safe, he sought a more secure location. He chose a spot behind a loose board beneath the feed storage shed, an area rarely inspected except during specific inventory checks. The decision was risky, but the urgency of protecting the information compelled him. What he did not anticipate was how quickly others would notice the changes in his behavior. Within a day, the senior overseer approached him with an air of calculated hostility, implying without words that questions were unwelcome and boundaries needed to be respected. The warning was not direct, but was unmistakably clear. Stop asking, stop looking, stay in line. Shortly after this encounter, a quiet search of his quarters occurred while he was occupied in the fields. Items were rearranged in subtle ways that only someone familiar with the space would notice, confirming that someone was probing for evidence of disloyalty. This intrusion forced him to retrieve the journal once again and relocate it in the middle of the night, choosing a spot even more concealed and inconvenient, one that required crawling through a cramped gap beneath an unused livestock pen. The physical discomfort of the hiding process felt insignificant compared to the stakes involved, but the incident left him shaken by the realization that he might soon run out of places to hide both the journal and his suspicions. As rumors continued to circulate among the enslaved community, the owner implemented a series of punishment rounds intended to silence dissent and reinforce control. Groups were summoned to the yard at irregular intervals, forced to stand in rigid formation while accusations were thrown at them without evidence. Sometimes the new overseer demanded confessions for imagined offenses. Other times he simply used the sessions to remind everyone of their vulnerability. The unpredictability of these episodes had a cumulative effect, breaking routines and replacing them with constant dread. The people in the quarters grew quieter at night, careful about every word spoken where walls were thin and listeners lurked. The protagonist perceived the sense of despair rising among them, recognizing that fear was being used not only to suppress truth, but to erase the possibility of resistance. The tensions escalated further when the new overseer publicly beat a young field worker under the pretext of insubordination. The event served as a demonstration of authority and a threat to anyone who might still be searching for answers about the missing man. Witnessing the brutality, the protagonist understood that the beating had not been about discipline, but about signaling the lengths to which the system would go to protect the owner's son. The Betrayal warning was not directed at the enslaved, but at him. Curiosity would have consequences. Watching the aftermath, workers struggling to concentrate, glancing over their shoulders, waiting for the next unpredictable outburst, he realized that by keeping his knowledge silent, he was participating in the preservation of a structure designed to obliterate the truth. Yet he also understood that exposing what he knew would almost certainly lead to his own execution or disappearance, buried under the same lies used to conceal the earlier murder. As these realizations solidified, the moral stakes became impossible to ignore. Every action he took or avoided carried implications for the lives around him. Silence meant complicity, but speaking meant destruction. The journal had evolved from a tool of introspection into a lifeline for the truth, but also a liability that tethered him to a path he was not sure he could walk. He found himself waking in the night, checking the corners of his quarters for shadows, listening for footsteps, replaying the warnings in his mind. What had begun as a subtle tension had turned into a constant, oppressive pressure that demanded a decision. The deeper he looked into the events surrounding the disappearance, the more clearly he saw that the plantation's leadership would shield the owner's son at any cost. This protection extended beyond simple cover-ups. It was embedded in the very structure of the plantation's hierarchy, in the unspoken agreements among overseers, in the quiet compliance of those who feared retribution. He recognized that exposing the truth would not merely challenge a single individual, but would strike at the foundation of the system itself. In the midst of his internal conflict, he began noticing small gestures from the enslaved community that suggested they understood pieces of the larger situation, even if they did not know all the details. Some workers lingered near him slightly longer than necessary, as if offering silent reminders that their safety hinged on forces beyond their control. Others kept a calculated distance, unwilling to be seen interacting with someone who had attracted the attention of the overseers. During brief pauses in labor, he observed signs of solidarity among them: shared glances, subtle shifts in formation, quiet exchanges of items or information. These interactions indicated that they were preparing for something, though he did not yet know whether it was a defensive posture or the beginning of a more deliberate response to the tightening conditions. The pressure grew when the assistant overseer confronted him indirectly by monitoring his routines more closely than ever before. He appeared at unexpected moments, counted tools, inspected equipment, and verified assignments with an exaggerated thoroughness. Although he never accused the protagonist directly, his presence conveyed suspicion. This persistent surveillance reinforced the message that any deviation from standard procedure would be noticed and reported. The protagonist felt the space around him shrink, reducing his movements to a sequence of actions governed by caution. Each day he carried the knowledge of the murder like a weight, and each night he wondered how many more steps he could take before the walls closed in. As he considered the possibilities, he realized there was no path forward that did not involve risk. The information he possessed could ignite consequences far beyond the plantation boundaries, but only if someone trustworthy could access it. He contemplated sending the journal to an outsider, perhaps a traveling tradesman or a relative in another county, but the logistics of such a transfer were fraught with danger. Even being seen writing could be grounds for punishment. The thought of burning the journal crossed his mind more than once, yet destroying it felt like destroying the only chance at justice. He continued performing his daily tasks with mechanical precision, but internally, he was calculating how long he could sustain the facade. The plantation environment had transformed into a crucible of contradictions, where obedience preserved life but violated conscience, and defiance honored principle but invited ruin. Every time he observed a worker flinch under the overseer's scrutiny or struggle through a task made unbearable by fear, he felt the weight of his inaction more acutely. The murder itself had been a result of unchecked power. Allowing that power to operate without challenge meant accepting that similar events would occur again. He recognized that the reason the owner and overseers acted with such ferocity was not merely to conceal the death, but to prevent any acknowledgement that the enslaved had the capacity to bear witness and remember. The system depended on the suppression of memory, the muting of testimony, the erasure of events that contradicted the official narrative. The protagonist understood that by writing the truth, he had already taken a step toward challenging that system, even if no one else ever read the journal. But writing was only one step. What mattered was what he chose to do next. He found himself examining both the land and the people around him with a new clarity, noticing patterns he had overlooked before, which workers avoided eye contact with the owner's son, which domestic servants carried unspoken tension, which overseers aligned themselves with the new order. The plantation felt like a field of hidden stories, each one carrying potential consequences. He realized that the truth he held was not an isolated fact, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation, violence, and betrayal that permeated every corner of the estate. As conditions worsened, he sensed that the plantation was nearing a breaking point. The combined effect of the increased surveillance, the escalating punishments, and the undercurrent of unresolved tension created an atmosphere in which even the smallest spark could lead to a crisis. Whether that crisis would come from the enslaved community, from the overseers, or from a misstep of his own was impossible to predict. All he knew was that the path he had been on since the first discovery was drawing him toward an irreversible decision, one that would determine whether the truth remained hidden or finally reached daylight. In the days leading up to the breaking point, an uneasy tension settled over the plantation, so heavy and persistent that even routine tasks felt charged with the threat of something imminent. The atmosphere had been deteriorating for weeks, but a second violent event shattered any remaining illusion that stability could be restored. It began during an early morning work assignment when a young enslaved man collapsed under the pressure of fatigue and fear, provoking a vicious response from the new overseer. Unlike the previous beating, which had been framed as punishment for alleged defiance, this attack escalated far beyond disciplinary intent. The overseer acted with a kind of frenzy that suggested he needed to reassert control not only over the workers, but over the unraveling narrative surrounding the disappearance. By the time he stopped, the man lay motionless, and the rest of the field crew stood frozen in horror. The overseer ordered several workers to carry the injured man away, and the group dispersed under a cloud of panic. Although the man survived the initial assault, the extent of his injuries suggested he might not recover. The brutality sent shockwaves through the community, igniting both fear and a simmering anger that could no longer be contained through routine suppression. As word of the incident spread, tension among the workers deepened into a volatile mix of dread and indignation. People moved through their tasks with muted coordination, communicating through glances and brief gestures rather than words. They sensed that the violence was no longer tied to behavior, but to the overseer's desperation to maintain the owner's narrative. The plantation leadership, aware that fear had reached a critical point, responded by tightening control further. Tasks were monitored with extreme scrutiny, curfews were enforced with rigid exactness, and even minor deviations from expected routines resulted in threats. The senior overseer and the new overseer began patrolling together at times, suggesting that they no longer trusted one another but shared a need to project unified authority. This joint presence made their movements unpredictable and magnified the pressure on everyone around them. In the owner's absence, the plantation operated like a failing mechanism, guided by fear, propelled by suspicion, and sustained only by the sheer force of coercion. The protagonist sensed that the collapse of the system could happen at any moment, though he could not predict from which direction the spark would come. He tried to maintain his routine to avoid drawing further attention, but his attempts to stay neutral only made him more aware of the growing instability. His secret had become a weight he carried constantly, reminding him that he stood at the crossroads between silence and exposure. The journal he had hidden now seemed more fragile than ever, an object that could shift the balance of power if discovered. He had planned to retrieve it and relocate it again, but the field assault disrupted the day so thoroughly that any movement away from supervised areas became nearly impossible. As he navigated through the newly intensified surveillance, he sensed that someone else had already begun searching for the missing evidence, his written account, or any sign of the questions he had been asking. The confirmation of this suspicion arrived with devastating clarity when he learned that the domestic servant who had shared the details of the murder had been punished severely. Her absence from her usual duties was initially noted only in whispers among the household staff, but the severity of her injuries soon became evident. She had been questioned about her knowledge of the events leading up to the disappearance, and although she had said nothing that could implicate him directly, her punishment indicated that her silence was not enough to satisfy those who feared she had spoken. The news struck the protagonist with a brutal sense of responsibility. Her suffering was a direct result of the information she had entrusted to him, and he recognized that the plantation leadership would stop at nothing to identify the source of any circulating truth. Her fate confirmed that the danger surrounding him had escalated to its highest point, and that the consequences of his choices were no longer abstract worries, but immediate realities borne by other people. The sense of unraveling intensified when the plantation's overseers discovered that an item of importance, some of the evidence collected earlier, was missing from a locked storage area near the main house. This evidence had been part of the early justification for blaming the missing worker for theft. When it could not be located, suspicion immediately shifted to anyone who might have had access. While he did not know exactly how the item had disappeared, the protagonist understood that the uproar surrounding its absence placed him in even greater danger. The senior overseer reacted with predictable hostility, and the owner's son, sensing an opportunity to redirect scrutiny, began maneuvering to frame another enslaved man for its disappearance. The chosen target was someone who had previously questioned the increased punishments and who had been seen near the storage shed days earlier. The accusation was structured to appear convincing, and the owner's son seemed determined to present it as evidence that disloyalty among the workers justified even harsher measures. As the plantation leadership prepared to punish the accused man, tension rose to a level that made violence inevitable. A small group of workers began quietly preparing for the possibility of escape, recognizing that staying meant risking death under the escalating aggression. Their plan was desperate and hastily formed, but desperation had replaced logic for many. The protagonist learned fragments of their intention not through direct communication, but through a series of subtle clues. Unusual movements after nightfall, items being shifted discreetly, a change in the usual silence around the quarters. He realized that their plan could collapse disastrously if the overseers discovered it, and that any attempt to flee would provoke a response that might kill many of them. Yet he also understood the urge to run. The plantation, once a rigid but predictable structure, had become a volatile and lethal environment where survival felt increasingly unlikely. The day of the confrontation approached with a sense of inevitability, as though all the separate threads of suspicion, violence, fear, and truth were converging into a single moment. The protagonist had not planned to accuse the owner's son publicly, but events unfolded in a way that left him little choice. As the senior overseer gathered the workers to announce the punishment of the falsely accused man, the owner's son pushed forward with a mixture of arrogance and desperation. His demeanor suggested that he needed this performance to restore authority and conceal his own involvement in the original murder. The situation reached a breaking point when the protagonist noticed the senior overseer holding his journal, not the original hiding place, but the journal itself, retrieved by hands that had searched more thoroughly than he anticipated. The overseer's grip on the journal was not casual. It was the grip of someone who had read enough to understand its implications. Seeing the journal in the overseer's possession forced the protagonist into a position where silence was no longer possible. The overseer's expression conveyed an intention to expose him, framing the writings as evidence of disloyalty or subversion. The protagonist understood that once the overseer spoke, the workers would be punished collectively, and he himself would be executed. In that moment, the burden of choice, survival versus truth, collapsed into a single necessity. The only path that remained was to bring the truth into the open, regardless of the consequences. In one decisive act, he addressed the gathered overseers, the workers, and the owner's son, naming the son as the perpetrator of the murder. His accusation shattered the fragile structure of control that had been rapidly deteriorating. The overseers reacted with disbelief and rage, the workers with shock and rising momentum, and the owner's son with an instinctive attempt to defend himself. The confrontation erupted into a chaotic struggle that unfolded with a speed no one could control. The senior overseer lunged toward the protagonist, attempting to silence him before the accusation could spread beyond the immediate circle. Several workers moved instinctively, either stepping back in fear or stepping forward in an attempt to intervene. The owner's son, panicked and irrational, reached for a weapon, but his actions only fueled the turmoil. In the frenzy that followed, someone fired a shot, a single, deafening report that cut through the shouting and the scrambling bodies. It was not immediately clear who had pulled the trigger, but the owner's son fell to the ground, struck by the bullet. His collapse created a moment of stunned silence, followed by an explosion of voices and movement as overseers and workers reacted in conflicting ways. The overseers attempted to secure the area, but the sheer number of people and the intensity of the chaos made control impossible. The death of the owner's son was an irreversible turning point. The overseers, driven by a mixture of fear and fury, turned their aggression on everyone present. The protagonist found himself caught in the middle, targeted both as a traitor to the plantation hierarchy and as the catalyst for the disorder. A blow from behind sent him sprawling, and he struggled to regain his balance amid the confusion. Several workers seized the opportunity to run, escaping toward the treeline at the edge of the property. Others remained frozen, paralyzed by uncertainty and the risk of being shot while fleeing. The senior overseer, consumed by rage, ordered men to secure the protagonist, but the intensity of the confrontation made it difficult for anyone to follow commands coherently. As the protagonist attempted to crawl away from the central chaos, he realized that the survival of the journal was now as uncertain as his own. In the struggle, it had fallen to the ground near the overseer who had held it, pages scattered and trampled by feet. Whether its contents would be readable, salvageable, or entirely destroyed was unclear. The journal had become both evidence and symbol, proof of the truth and also a target for destruction. Whether it survived would determine whether the truth could ever be told beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The protagonist managed to reach the edge of the crowd before collapsing from exhaustion and injury. He felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him, mixed with a clarity that he had chosen the only path left that retained any measure of integrity. He had exposed the truth, but the cost of that exposure was borne not only by him, but by everyone around him. The plantation had descended into chaos, driven by fear, betrayal, and the consequences of a system built on violence. As overseers and workers scattered in different directions, as shouts mingled with gunfire and commands dissolved into confusion, The protagonist lay on the ground struggling to remain conscious. The reckoning he had faced was both moral and physical, and he understood that the outcome, whether he lived, died, or was captured, no longer mattered as much as the fact that the truth had finally been forced into the open. Whether justice would follow, or whether the system would simply erase the evidence and retaliate against the powerless, remained unknown. But the confrontation had shattered the structure that had protected lies for so long, and something irrevocable had been set in motion. The days that followed the violent rupture felt as if the plantation itself had been flung into a realm where time moved unevenly, rushing in panicked currents and then sinking into stagnant, oppressive stillness. The overseers who survived the upheaval strode through the fields with clipped commands and hands coiled around their weapons as if the very air were conspiring against them. The once routine rhythms of work, misery, and fragile endurance were replaced by an aggressive urgency to reassert control before rumor grew into memory and memory into defiance. The leadership, shaken in ways they refused to articulate, tightened every measure of discipline, creating a regime harsher than the one that had provoked the first cracks. Men who once relied on predictable brutality now wielded it erratically, lashing out not only at perceived threats, but at their own fear of losing the plantation's myth of invincibility. Yet for all their bluster, every whip raised trembled imperceptibly, betraying their knowledge that the order they defended had already begun to rot beneath them. Inside the main house, the administrators drafted official accounts that attempted to suffocate the truth beneath a thick layering of convenient lies. They recorded the violence as an isolated outbreak of savagery, describing it as proof of an inherent animalistic nature rather than the product of systematic cruelty and desperation. They erased their own wrongdoing with deliberate strokes, replacing murdered names with invented causes of death, turning acts of resistance into accidents, and turning their own policies into benevolent guardianship. Their false narratives seeped into ledgers, monthly reports, and correspondence with distant investors who preferred numbers to humanity and who asked only whether profits could still be expected on schedule. This institutional rewriting functioned like a second form of violence, one aimed not at the body but at memory itself. The plantation leadership feared the truth not because it was incriminating, but because once spoken aloud, it might fracture the foundation on which their authority rested. Among the enslaved community, survival became a quiet ritual performed without the luxury of hope. The trauma of the uprising, if it could be called that, for it was little more than an eruption of long-contained rage, settled in their bones like a winter that refused to end. The fields felt different now, not merely because of the harsher surveillance, but because every step carried the weight of those who had not survived the night's confusion. Mothers, fathers, and friends worked with the knowledge that someone once beside them was now absent, and that no ceremony would acknowledge their loss. The scars were emotional, invisible, and unspoken, yet shared universally. They adapted to the new conditions with the grim pragmatism that had sustained them through all previous horrors, but beneath their silence lived a flickering, fragile sense of having seen the plantation's inner weakness for the first time. Even if they could not voice it, even if fear demanded outward obedience, something irreversible had happened within them. As for the overseer whose journal had captured the moral decay of the plantation with ruthless honesty, his fate unfolded under a shadow of contradictions. He survived the direct violence, though survival became a dubious blessing. For several days after the turmoil, he hid himself in the abandoned smokehouse behind the livestock pens, too injured to flee and too fearful to show his face. The leadership sent men to search for him, not out of concern, but because loose ends were dangerous, and he had seen too much. When they eventually found him, hollow-eyed and unable to stand without help, they decided not to kill him outright. Instead, they dragged him back to the overseer's quarters, where he was interrogated not about his moral failings, but about logistical details, names, movements, motives, anything that could be used to further tighten control. He answered minimally, aware that any admission might betray the very workers he had tried, in small ways, to shield. His injuries healed slowly, but his mind did not. The plantation allowed him to continue his duties, though stripped of responsibility and treated as a reminder of what weakness looked like. His colleagues viewed him with suspicion, unsure whether his survival made him complicit or merely lucky, while the enslaved workers regarded him with a mixture of pity and guarded contempt. He walked the fields like a ghost, neither feared nor respected, his presence tolerated only because expelling him would require acknowledging the plantation's own role in the chaos. He no longer wrote in his journal, perhaps because he sensed that any written truth now carried the risk of becoming evidence against those who deserved protection, or perhaps because he no longer believed in the purpose of recording anything at all. He drifted through his duties with the posture of a man aware that his life had narrowed to a single, suffocating path from which no honorable escape remained. Among the enslaved population, whispers about him circulated cautiously, shaped by grief, resentment, and the fractured memory of the night's events. Some saw him as a coward who had failed to intervene when he was most needed, and they were not wrong in believing that he had not done enough. Others regarded him as a flawed ally whose small gestures of protection, though ultimately insufficient, had made certain sufferings more bearable. A few insisted that he had acted nobly, even heroically, during the worst moments, though their accounts were always murky, shaped by limited visibility and the chaos of the conflict. Because no consensus could be reached, the man became less a figure than a story told differently, depending on who spoke and what they needed the story to mean. The plantation leadership, however, avoided mentioning him at all, hoping that erasing his significance would prevent anyone from questioning how such moral corruption had been allowed to grow within their ranks. Silence became their preferred weapon, blunting inquiry before it could be formed. Within the domestic servants' quarters, where information flowed more readily between whispered conversations and shared chores, fragments of the truth were preserved with careful attention. These men and women had seen more than the leadership realized, for their proximity to the main house had granted them insight into both the secret cruelties and the private hypocrisies of those who claimed authority. They remembered the overseer's journal even if they had never touched it, remembering the way he sometimes carried it with the same tension one might reserve for a confession bound in leather. When he grew too weak to guard his belongings, a young housemaid found the journal beneath his cot and recognized immediately the danger it posed. She hid it within a gap in the floorboards beneath the pantry, a place where only those who worked closest to the house could reach. From then on, the journal became a quiet burden, shared among a few trusted individuals who read it in hurried fragments whenever opportunity allowed, each gaining a deeper understanding of the plantation's hidden machinery of violence. The journal, though never intended for an audience, became a testament too powerful to destroy and too dangerous to reveal. It contained evidence not simply of individual crimes, but of a systemic rot that extended beyond one plantation and into an economic order built on suffering. It documented names, dates, decisions, and motivations, recorded acts of exploitation committed not in anger, but in routine, and revealed how even those who believed themselves morally conflicted could become instruments of destruction through inaction alone. Passed quietly from one trusted reader to another, it served not as a guide to rebellion, but as a moral ledger that confirmed what everyone already knew yet seldom saw written: that the plantation thrived not because its leaders were strong, but because the voices of those beneath them were suppressed. Its existence offered a certain grim vindication, for it proved that at least one observer had recognized the cruelty for what it was, even if he had lacked the courage to fully oppose it. Over time, the leadership became aware that some document might exist, something that threatened the neat narrative they hoped to impose on the history of the unrest. They conducted searches of the quarters, confiscated papers, and even questioned the overseer himself, though he denied any knowledge of what they described. Still, they sensed his fear, mistaking it for guilt, and increased their pressure accordingly. Yet the journal remained safe, preserved through ingenuity and loyalty rather than defiance. Even if it were someday destroyed by fire, water, or discovery, its content had already seeped into the oral memory of those who guarded it. They recited passages in private moments, integrating its descriptions into their own recollections of the plantation's darkest hours. In this way, the journal created a legacy independent of its physical survival, ensuring that its condemnation of the plantation's cruelty would not vanish entirely even if written proof were someday erased. The years trickled forward with the slow persistence of a river carving its way through rock, reshaping identities and memories along the way. The survivors among the enslaved people continued to endure, carrying the trauma of the uprising as both a wound and a warning. The overseer aged prematurely under the weight of what he had witnessed and failed to prevent. The plantation leadership changed personnel, but not practices, their authority propped up by the same mixture of violence and denial that had defined the institution from the start. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of the journal continued to exert a subtle influence, forming an underground current of truth that refused to be fully smothered. Over time, descendants of the workers who survived passed down fragments of the journal's contents as cautionary tales. Some versions emphasized betrayal, others bravery, and still others the corrosive effects of complicity. Each retelling preserved a piece of the truth, though never the complete picture. The story evolved into a whispered reminder that power, when left unchecked, could reshape even the most reluctant participants into instruments of harm. It served as a warning to future generations that silence, though often chosen out of fear, could allow injustice to flourish unchecked. The overseer himself faded into obscurity, his final years marked by a hollowed passivity that transformed him from a participant in the system to an emblem of its moral consequences. He died quietly, leaving behind no family and no official recognition, but his journal, whether physically intact or preserved through memory, lingered as the most truthful account of the plantation's inner life. In the style of a historical documentary, the final reflection invites a broader reckoning. It is impossible to read the overseer's journal or even to imagine its contents through the fragments that survived, without confronting painful questions about the nature of justice within systems built on violence. Justice, in such a context, becomes not an attainable ideal but an aspiration suffocated by the very structures meant to maintain order. The plantation was designed to perpetuate inequality, to enforce compliance through fear, and to isolate individuals from the power of collective action. Within such a world, even those who recognized the moral catastrophe unfolding around them found themselves trapped between the desire to intervene and the fear of being crushed for doing so. His failure, though personal, reflects a universal dilemma. How many individuals throughout history have seen wrongdoing clearly, yet chosen silence because they believed their resistance would be in vain? The journal's existence, even if only as rumor, raises further questions about how many stories of cruelty, bravery, and betrayal were lost because they were never written down or because they were deliberately destroyed by those with something to hide. For every document that survived, countless others disappeared, erasing not only evidence, but the voices of those whose suffering deserved remembrance. Regardless of its physical fate, the journal's legacy prompts us to consider the consequences of complicity and the moral responsibilities of those who witness injustice. It reminds us that systems of oppression thrive not only through the actions of the powerful, but through the silence of those who allow violence to become routine. Ultimately, the Overseer's Journal stands as a testament to the uncomfortable truth that morality is not measured by intention alone, but by action, or the lack thereof. It forces us to confront the reality that even those who recognize the immorality of their circumstances can become instruments of harm when they fail to speak or act. And it challenges us to consider our own place within the structures we inherit, urging us to question the stories we accept, the histories we overlook, and the truths we choose not to confront.